beaver ecology and beaver-mediated resilience and restoration of degraded and wildfire impacted streams. That work, plus the increased priority of providing beaver coexistence outreach and services, and the amplification of the growing call for modernizing beaver management across Washington state and the US, continues under her tenure at the Methow Beaver Project.
I'm setting a timer because anyone who's seen me present before knows I have a tendency to go long. So I'm going to do my best to not do that. Then I'll try to figure how to work this. Okay, damned if you do and damned if you don't. I am going to focus a lot on beaver dams and fish passage in the anadromous zone. Anadromous meaning mostly salmonid species that are born in freshwater, move to saltwater, and then come back again for spawning. So just want to make sure everybody's got that language fairly clear. I do want to take the time for a land acknowledgement. We do operate, live, do restoration in the watersheds of the Methow and Okanagan people. And I like to make sure people understand that we are committed to not only watershed restoration, but cultural restoration in all the work that we do. And we partner with tribes whenever possible, specifically the Colville tribes, representing 12 smaller bands of Native Americans in our watershed. So appreciate all the work they do to make their own culture better over time. So our mission, to partner with native beavers and communities to adapt to climate change. In a nutshell, that is what we do since 2008, and we are expanding our mission regularly as our understanding of beavers and then their importance on the landscape becomes more clear to us. And that is only possible through partnership and collaboration with so many different amazing people who represent different groups across our watershed, our county, our state, our region, and nationally, and now internationally for sure. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the things that the Methow Beaver Project focuses on. We started as focusing on water storage. We quickly looked at floodplain connectivity as one of the keys to water storage, especially in the highly degraded systems of the West. Biodiversity and habitat complexity, rebuilding ecosystems for all the biological communities, not just humans. Resilience to disturbance, in particular wildfire and climate change in the future to come. And then specifically habitat restoration for endangered species. It looks like it's off the page. And one of the ways we do this, watershed restoration, is beaver relocation or reintroduction. That is what we started as an organization in 2008. That's what we focused on, was relocating conflict beavers to areas that hadn't seen beavers in decades or hundreds of years since extirpation or near extirpation. And we do focus a lot on highly impacted areas, especially now wildfire in particular, as you can see in the background, completely burned upper landscape, but a lot of aspen regeneration in that foreground. And beavers tend to thrive in areas like that, even after wildfire. And you often get results like this, which are so exciting. And I would be dancing a jig on that dam if I were there right now. This is one of the things I'm most excited about in our work. I had to plug all these things. This is a highly impacted, debris flow impacted stream. This is the kind of activity that occurs in streams after wildfire and after a big precipitation event. You have incredible incision in some places. Emily Fairfax has seen a lot of this in her work as well. You can have up to 3-4 meters of incision in an area, but this is where we've reintroduced beavers without doing any structure restoration in that stream. And beavers are already building that substrate back up, that severely incised channel back up, trying to reach the floodplains where aspens are regrowing and they have plenty of food source. So they still have a few 2 meters to go. They've only been at this for about 4 years. Since they got into this area after wildfire. So when you talk about stream evolution and on the order of hundreds to thousands of years for things to repair without beavers in the system, I vote for beavers in the system. This is an area after wildfire too, where beavers have completely restored the incised channel. So, and we also do beaver mimicry, prepping streams, to jumpstart them in order to support beavers better. So those are some of the things. Well, okay, keep going. We do more. We do beaver coexistence and outreach and services. We want to help convince people to live with beavers as much as possible so we can increase beaver populations through dispersal from successfully reproducing beaver populations. I think that's one of our best bets to partner with beavers for increasing and expanding their benefits on the landscape. But relocation should always be a tool you have in your basket. If you don't have it yet in your state, hopefully you're working on gaining that ability to do so, because relocation is a critical part, though our last choice of tool typically. Okay, beavers in the anadromous zone. This is an incredibly amazing stream restoration site in Washington State, just a side channel off the Methow River. It was restored for juvenile salmon rearing habitat and overwintering habitat. It was not planned to have beavers in this system, but they came anyways, as so many, you've heard a lot of people saying beavers showed up to our stream restoration site. There's a reason for that. When you restore a stream, it makes it better, and it can often support beavers after you've made it a little better than it was. So ecology is complex, and managing ecosystems is also complex. Humans tend to simplify their environment, and when you do that, you are limiting the ability of that system to have complexity again. So one of the things I really want to talk to you all about today about managing fish, especially endangered fish, where beavers are coming back into a system or exist in the system already, is that beavers are often pointed to as the problem, where it's really the modification of the landscape that is the problem. And how do we compromise? We can't always change the landscape. In fact, we rarely can change the landscape. Hopefully that is a future endeavor we can embark on more, working with our departments of transportation and future development of residential areas. But in the meantime, we have simplified systems like this one, where you don't have a lot of opportunity to expand complexity when beavers do move in. So one of the things we want to talk about is the potential challenges and necessary considerations when you're partnering with beavers to benefit fishes. And willing landowner is the first place to start. This particular spot is owned by WDFW, which is Washington's Department of Fish and Wildlife, that manages a lot of land, but also all of our fish and all of our other species. You have, again, I talked about the simplified, confined, and controlled systems to manage human infrastructure and priorities, whether that's residential property, commercial property, irrigation development, roads, etc. There's a lot of priorities for humans on the landscape, not so many for habitat for other species. Most of these, limited space for expansion. You have limited space for process evolution. So you can get to passage challenges when a beaver does build a dam. This is a really big dam in the background of this picture. One of the things that caused the problem here in the anadromous zone, where you typically have in our neck of the woods, Pacific Northwest, I didn't mention that that's where this is, Methow, you're in north central Washington within the Pacific Northwest. You have a lot of protection of that human infrastructure done through levees or dikes. So they cut off the upper end of a side channel of a main stem river. You no longer get flushing flows through that side channel. But sometimes you get backwater flows into that side channel that are still making it really good fish habitat, not as good as it was, but good. But then you have a beaver move in there, and some people would say that's great, but people who restored it for salmon access might not think it's so great. So that's what we're going to keep talking about, is some of those considerations that you need to make of the landowners, the stream restoration projects, your priority species that you're managing for, the human impacts on the landscape. And then you have the hydrology and geomorphology. So gaining or losing reaches, that can determine the success of a project with beavers, with fish. If that's not something that's familiar to you, gaining or losing reaches, we could talk a little bit more about that if you're working in specific salmon habitat on main stem rivers. It's a really important factor to factor in, but I won't go into the details of that. But also the natural processes that beaver dams may only allow seasonal passage. under these circumstances, meaning high flow periods in our neck of the woods, that spring, snowmelt, runoff time, on the west side of our state, it can happen throughout the year, winter as well, that you get high flows from rain. So it all depends on your context in your system you're managing, but it's also natural for salmon to potentially get behind dams and stay there for a season or even a year if water quality will support that. So again, here comes monitoring that's really required to understand what's going on in these places where beavers might be in training or entrapping salmon or other fish species. Can they survive there because of the habitat quality as well? Like any of these talks, there's so much more to this story than what I can possibly present to you in 25 minutes. Now I'm down to 17. 14. Whew. Okay. Silver side channel. I'm really just going to jump into this specific case study for everyone to have an understanding of a complex system that we're trying to manage for salmon and for beaver benefits. So silver side channel cut off by, well, here's a blueprint of what it looks like in the picture. The blue line is the channel, and you see some relic channels throughout that floodplain. This is the town of Silver. That was the first town in the Methow Valley way back in the late 1800s, established town. There's plenty of mining and trapping and everything before that, but this was the first established town to protect it. In the 40s, a levee was built, and because part of the town washed out before that levee was built, and so they built a levee to protect the town of Silver, which then was defunct anyways. People abandoned it, but nevertheless, they didn't abandon the levee. That still exists today, but we do get groundwater flows into this silver side channel that is cold and clean and supports salmon for a short period of the year as this system was restored from a very shallow, wide, spring-like channel because it doesn't have that upstream connection. So salmon recovery, which started in the late 90s in our neck of the woods, focused on trying to create that single, simple, sinuous channel for salmon to thrive in. But this is only about 3 feet deep and about 3 feet wide, this side channel that you see in the picture. And it really only supports salmon in the cooler parts of a summer, not in the hot heat of summer, and not in the winter because it can freeze to the bottom or close to it. There isn't a lot of mass or volume of water in there to support them. And they didn't plan for beavers in this very simplified system. So this circle represents the only outlet of that channel with low flow, no flushing flows. Beavers found it within a year and a half of the stream restoration project finishing. It's on the main stem of the Methow. We have beavers in the main stem of the Methow. They were bound to find it. I do want to note, pay attention to this, the edge of the restored side channel where that yellow arrow is pointing, you still have a lot of green riparian zone between the edge of the channel and the riparian zone. Well, this is what it looked like after beavers moved in. And I want you to note the expansion of surface water from beavers moving into this restored side channel and, spring-like, meaning it doesn't have flushing flows through the top end. The expansion was huge. And what I like to make sure everyone who looks at this site knows is that this site needed both restoration and beavers to be as good as it is today. And it's taken a lot of convincing of the people that worked on this restoration project that beavers improved the system rather than ruined it. But those are partnerships worth working on, that you want to make sure people look at beavers as a benefit, even though it changed something for someone. Change is hard. We all know that. It's the same with beavers. People aren't used to seeing them on the landscape as clearly. This is just to show you a little bit more of how this dam evolved and how big it is and how it was continuing to expand when we got involved in managing the beavers there at the request of the state, how complex it was becoming. These are the canals Emily talked of earlier. They're throughout this system now. And they probably were long before, but they're back again. The beavers have re-excavated and they're working hard. They're creating in-stream complexity or in-off-channel complexity that supports fish tremendously. And some of this area is so deep it tops your waders. And this is the newly inundated side channel of the side channel. So it's pretty exciting how complex this became. One of the coolest things is that this side channel is still backwater. So it allows juvenile salmon to get into the habitat, even with a beaver dam there. And this is a sort of a high flow season picture, even higher flow as it was going up. And I'm just that's a beaver who's hanging out there. And what we were doing here is monitoring when it fully backwatered, when high flows did. So right around 8,000 plus, it would fully backwater over the non-managed beaver dams, okay? This is what it looks like most of the year. A much different story, except for about a week period in an average flow year that juvenile salmon could get into that system on their own, unassisted. So beavers were just building this higher and higher. And as all of us are pretty clear on, beavers taught salmon to jump. Some salmon could jump parts of this dam at some point in the year, but not throughout. And it's unreasonable to look for year-round passage when you have beavers in a system for fish. It is reasonable to consider seasonal passage, but how long is that season? That's something we can manage, okay? So I just wanted to give this perspective. This is my crew out here as we're evaluating how to do coexistence at this site, just to show you how big the dams are. And then to answer an earlier comment, I want you to note the sediment up against the face of this dam. Not every dam can support fish passage through the interstitial spaces. Yes, I'm a big proponent to say a lot of juvenile fish can get through a dam, especially if it's a new dam. It's new construction from beavers. Those dams tend to be weaker, not fully sedimented in. This is a new dam, but in a highly sedimented side channel. So fish are unlikely to move through this dam at low flows, even though there's consistent flow, through the actual dam itself. And that was what we started to run up against with fish bios, is like, that's not gonna work for juvenile salmon to get through that on their own. We did a lot of snorkel surveys and a lot of monitoring before we made suggestions for what to do at this site to manage beavers. That didn't include removing them. That was the beauty of this project. Our landowner did not want to remove the beavers, but wanted to compromise on the stream restoration priorities. So here are baby salmon, endangered steelhead and spring chinook, all throughout the woody structure of the dam. And our April survey showed only salmon downstream of the dam, no salmon upstream of the dam. So we were like, okay, they're not really getting in there. And that's a problem, because that's a priority to have that habitat for juvenile salmon. So we work with all the partners, the landowners, the stream restoration partners, which were Cascade Fisheries, the Colville tribes are pictured here, and WDFW, and a few folks who didn't show up because they were too angry with the state for trying to manage beavers in place. We measured things, we talked to Mike, I'm a Beaver Corps graduate. We did a lot of designing and talking about protecting the beavers' lodge entrances as sort of our minimum willingness to bring surface water elevation down. There's so many details that go into this. I'm not going to go into all of them, but there's a lot of things to think about when you are managing beavers in any landscape, but especially for endangered species. You get a lot of eyes on your project and wanting to see how you're doing this and what the results are. But managing beavers' lodge entrances is a priority so they don't react strongly to any coexistence solution or necessarily leave the project site, which we didn't want either. We did a lot of, again, monitoring, choosing the height of the dam to match the lodge entrances, bringing the surface water down in phases, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Here's the start of our coexistence project. We are lowering the surface water elevation. You can see these two notches that we made to more rapidly lower. We're working with a very large system here, so we wanted to lower the water enough to even install our devices. Elisa, who's going to speak next, came out and did hands-on training with us, as she had done quite a few more coexistence projects than we had. And even though I was taking the Beaver Corps training, it's always nice to have someone who knows what they're doing on site. So that was a huge worthy investment. Here is us working on putting the surface water control elevation device in. But this is what was different. We put in a juvenile passage device as well. That's that small 4-inch pipe that these folks are carrying. And we worked it in at first with the crab pot, but I'll get to a little bit more of like the adaptive management we had to do with our juvenile fish passage. I've always struggled to say that. And how it's finally working. It's working, okay? So we installed that juvenile fish passage, I'll go back just a second, to maintain or extend the opportunity for juveniles to move out of the site in case water quality degraded. Yes, juveniles can survive elsewhere in this system if they can get there. And with the beaver dam as it was unlikely for them to be able to leave the system if water quality degraded. We experience 100-degree weather throughout the summer. Last summer, we hit 115 with the heat dome. We are so grateful we had deeper water at this site. We never would have had juvenile salmon in that system without the deeper water for that mass and area. Oops, wrong way. We had a system that was a gaining reach with groundwater. We put the juvenile passage device pipe below our surface water elevation pipe. We knew what our stream flow at its lowest was going to be, around 4 CFS. We knew we could maintain that 4 CFS through our pipe, but we needed to make sure our juvenile passage device was below that, so it always had water running through it. If you want more details on that, please come talk to me. I'm happy to share them, but with the amount of time, I just want to make sure people understand that this can work. And the context matters, but it can work. So here we're putting the juvenile passage cage. We used a crab cage to protect the upstream end of the juvenile passage device. It turned out, we put it close to the dam face. It turned out the beavers really, I'm just gonna give you pictures as I go through here, what it looked like after installation. There's the little device next to the big outflow surface water elevation device. Lowering the water, looking at the dam face. We had to, I'm gonna skip it through these fast because the countdown is killing me. 3 minutes, As we lowered surface water elevation, one of the key things that we focused on through Mike's training is, actually this came from Elisa more, and I wanna give her credit for that, is lowering the freeboard that was exposed as you lower surface water elevation, to take that idea away from the beavers that they ever had water that high to begin with. Whether it truly works or not, it did work here. And we did lower the water in 2 phases because we were lowering it 18 inches approximately. And Mike had given us really good feedback to not lower it more than a foot if you could, but that was a compromise with stream restoration folks, is to lower it almost 2 feet. So we did. This was our second phase of lowering it. After that was supposed to show you that the beavers didn't respond strongly to it. They just lived with it because we lowered the dam face along with the surface water. We lowered it a second time. We lowered the dam face again. They did not respond to it. It was awesome. We had such a great success. This is showing you the amount of surface water reduced. We had a ton of mud around for a while till it all dried out. We still protected the lodge entrances. But then the fish passage, the beavers found the fish passage entrances again and again. We moved it, they found it again. And then finally we decided, like, why don't we make this more like the surface water elevation cage? That worked great until the beavers chewed up the pipe. We fixed that by wrapping the pipe just like we did the big pipe in fencing. It has worked ever since then. That was in 2020, no issues ever since. So this is what it looks like now in concept. Anyone is welcome to these drawings. I share very freely. This is what it looks like from drone imagery. And again, this was 2020. So that was the surface water control and the fish passage device circled there. And then our outflow of both. We have coho coming up the big pipe to spawn in these areas. We have beavers and coho. totally complementing one another and engaging, obviously, with each other. We monitor the heck out of it. We put a microarray to monitor downstream juvenile fish passage. We do have trapping in the site because it's public land. But our surveys have shown we've had endangered steelhead in the ponds since then. There they are. Oh, that actually has the device in the background. It's so cool. Flow device. Those are endangered steelhead. We have lowered the dam face, so we have connection with the backwatering for 4 to 5 weeks now, rather than 1 week, as we did with the taller beaver dams. Those are just pictures of that comparison before and after. So we're doing all kinds of monitoring. We're getting evidence of fish passage downstream, and we're getting over 1,200 juveniles found in the system when we found 0 before. So I just encourage anyone who's interested to talk about water quality or expansion to get a hold of me, because I love this stuff. And natural processes are always better. This is a natural process system where we're working with bringing beavers into the anadromous zone where we can afford to have complexity in the system. Always go with that first. I'd love to take questions, but this is a very specific realm. So if people have anadromous or even residential fish questions and fish passage, I've been doing a lot of work on this, help of Mike Callahan, help of a lot of other people working on it too. Well, a few, there's not a lot, a few other people working on it too. So if you have questions, find me later if you don't get a chance now.
Hi, thank you so much, Alexa. My name is Chelsea Bowler, and I'm here with my colleague Steph, and we do similar work in Newfoundland and Canada with Atlantic salmon.
Awesome.
So I was super excited about your presentation. An issue that we have had over the last few years of modifying some of these flow devices in our systems is that our river systems seem to be very flashy, and then we have a lot of issues with ice as well. This example seems to be like pretty picture perfect after you were able to figure out some of those modifications that so the beavers weren't interacting with the device. I'm just wondering if you have any experience on river systems where they might be a little flashier. We've had issues with devices washing out, entire dams washing out, and sometimes the device that is the tube that's through the dam stays, but then the cage is like flipping up over top of the dam. So I'm just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, if you have any experience with that.
I think Mike would be the best person to talk about how to stabilize these devices more than me. I've only done, comparatively a handful compared to Beaver Solutions. But what I will say is one of the things our fish bios talk a lot about is if you have high flow systems or flashy systems that do wash out a beaver dam or over top a beaver dam, if you can accommodate that complexity, if you're not just trying to control surface water elevation, but you're really focused on juvenile salmon passage or adult salmon passage to get upstream to more spawning grounds, sometimes the blowing out of those dams seasonally and letting them rebuild every year is the only solution you need. And that's something we've talked about, natural processes, using that education and outreach with the people who didn't come up through the academic system or the professional world with looking at natural processes as the solution that's needed. That might be as simple as that. But if it's not as simple as that, I think it's experimenting and tweaking with, we don't want to stabilize beaver dams. That's one of the beauties of the structure in systems is that it is dynamic and it's changing constantly and you allow complexity, but you can stabilize coexistence devices. It doesn't have to be permanent, but it can be more stable potentially to withstand some of your 20-year flows or something to that effect, or even 10-year flows. That's changing rapidly. We're all experiencing some of these 20-year flows every 2 years instead of every 20 years. So I'd love to talk to you about it more afterwards. I think there's always, it's always room for trying. And if you have willing partners and landowners who are also desperate for a solution, it's worth looking at beavers and the long-term management of this. This is what I want everyone to hear. When you are looking for long-term process-based management, sometimes you can't get there in 5 years. But what do you do with endangered species who need that management now? You put in short-term, maybe coexistence devices with another pipe, even though we're trying to get rid of culverts and passage barriers, that maybe this type is one we can live with for a short term while we still look for the long-term solution, like purchasing lands and allowing that channel migration complexity to occur. So you have multiple passageways throughout a year or something to that effect. There's other long-term solutions that this can help get us to.
So I'm from the Northwest as well, and I know that dams, man-made dams and reservoirs are a really big problem for salmon passage. And also due to the fact that they get so hot, obviously it's still water. But I know that beaver dams and ponds promote groundwater exchange because of the weight that they put, and it cools the rivers. So I was just confused about how reservoirs get so hot if they would also be promoting groundwater exchange in that same way.
Well, that is not my area of expertise, but I can try to engage with that. Smaller systems, smaller surface area of water in a beaver pond than the incredibly large surface area of a reservoir behind a dam. You also have very little complexity behind a reservoir in a dam, whereas in a beaver pond, you have increasing complexity all the time by the channels being dug, canals being dug, trees coming down, bank dens, all sorts of complexity occurring increasingly behind a beaver dam. And then you typically have one beaver dam becomes 2, 4, 8, if it's an area that can accommodate that many beavers. And then you have a lot of microhabitat behind a beaver dam where temperature can vary tremendously from surface water to the deepest parts to underbank area to a tunnel area, where that's not something that's researched well at this point, is the heterogeneity of temperatures behind a beaver dam upstream of a beaver complex or within a beaver complex. Whereas behind a dam, you typically don't have that temperature heterogeneity. You have it where you have tributaries coming in, potentially bringing cold water in, and that's typically where fish go and hang out until nighttime or until a cooler period, where then they'll travel up through that warm water to get to the next refugia of cold water. The Pacific Northwest or the Columbia River in particular, and all her tributaries offer a lot of challenges to salmon, of course, but if we can get at least habitat improved where they can get to and spawn and make new fishies, that is a key to supporting them. I mean, until we remove dams or until we improve ocean conditions, it's going to be a really tough road for salmon. But if they can make it back, and they do, they're amazing. Not in the numbers we would like, but when they do, we want to give them a good place to land.
So what's the natural balance that, pre-humans was struck such that beavers didn't just build dams that salmon can pass all the time? And why isn't that the case now? Is it just that there's human pressure on salmon now, so they have to take away some of the beaver pressure, or is it something the beavers are doing differently?
Well, beavers dominated our watersheds before settlement. I mean, if you've read any of the trapper journals, or you've read Eager, or any of the, once they were hats, explains a lot about what a different system existed then, and that there's always change in a dynamic system. There was almost always options for species like a salmon to move. And if they couldn't go to exactly where they wanted, they could go somewhere else that a beaver wasn't blocking, or they could jump a beaver dam, or they could hole up and live fine in a beaver complex for a while until something opened up in that system. But it was so wetted, so complex, there were options. And that's what resilience means, is options, really. And now we live in such a human-dominated environment where land conversion is the way, it's the norm. There's such simplified systems of straightened channels, structure removed, protection with armored banks and levees, dams to hold back water and irrigate, canals shunting water away from streams to water our food. There isn't a lot of room for beavers without causing conflict. And that's the same for salmon, where we're wanting to restore habitat. It's often simplified systems that we're working in. Beavers come in and start to improve it, but that's not looking like an improvement for everyone, even if it's an improvement for salmon. And yes, seasonal entrainment would have been normal for salmon, meaning they get stuck in an area as low flows in the Pacific Northwest, at least. Snowpack dominated water system, at least on the east side of the Cascades. They would have gotten stuck there for late summer, fall, until fall rains potentially came, or even potentially till spring high flows came again. But there was enough complexity in that habitat for them to survive in that environment. There isn't that anymore. We have to fight for that complexity. We have to restore that complexity and protect that complexity. So it's a big difference. They're incredibly limited in the environment, at least in the Pacific Northwest. Again, that's where I hail from. If you're from a different place and you have different problems, I'd love to hear about it and talk about like ideas, brainstorm about it. But I don't know every system, especially the Atlantic salmon conditions, even though I grew up in Virginia, but I wasn't into beavers then, sadly. So
Thank you,
Yeah.
Alexa.
thank you, everyone.